Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today. Your pushback channel. Thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to sort of use as a launching pad the breathtaking politicization of the legal judicial system in Britain. Now it was underway already, but it's been taken to breathtaking proportions by the incumbent Labor government, which is completely controlled by the World Economic Forum, by the way, and by the globalists. So they're doing the globalist bidding. I wouldn't be surprised if the globalists are having daily meetings and phone calls. Okay, do this, do that, subvert this law, politicize that. I mean, so it's the playbook that the globalists need and must use in order to put their program into place. Now they've lost control of America with the incoming Trump administration. They're going to rely more heavily in the Anglosphere in particular on places like Britain to continue holding the torch for globalization. But I want to talk about the methods of politicizing and the social structures that are in place that if you like, cause or at least a part of the causal factors for the authorities as they see this need to politicize and subvert and engage in blatantly unjust behavior in order to achieve their political objectives. Now, the political objectives of the globalists is mass migration of brown and black peasants into the white West, and they don't want anything to interfere with that, and will go to incredible lengths to make sure that that is still moving forward in the way they want. If you look at all the Western countries, which the globalists controlled all of them up until the recent election of Donald Trump, then if you look at the mass migration numbers relative to population and so on, and the sources of the surplus populations in the world that are being moved into the West, it's exactly the same. I mean, clearly, each country is getting its orders from the globalist. Okay, we budget you 1 million new immigrants each year. So that's how they're doing it. And of course, these politicians that don't represent the people anymore are going along with it. But what if there's pushback from the local population? Well, we don't want it. We never voted for this. We don't want this. We don't agree with this. And if things happen that make the mass migration program look bad, like grooming gangs in Britain, for example, the response of the authorities to say, well, okay, priority number one is to continue mass migration. We must prevent any information getting out into the circulating in the media or in the public domain, which we must prevent any information which makes mass migration look bad. So, and anyone that talks about it, then we have to put them in prison, not the criminals such as the grooming gangs or something like that. We have to actually put people in prison. We've got to stop people talking about it, and we've got to keep a lid on any discontent that might ignite any sort of brush fire. We've got to keep a lid on any discontent, but be it justified, reasonable, truthful or not. We have to put a lid on any discontent that might in any way impede, obstruct, slow down, or bring into disrepute the mass migration program we are imposing on every white Western country. We are determined to fight to the death. We will level the landscape if we have to make sure that we're able to continue this mass migration program. So anyway, now if we go back to, if you have a homogeneous population, the type of laws and the enforcement of laws tend to shift more to a class-based than a race-based. For example, the laws on theft were very harsh in homogeneous Britain. Say in the, for example, for a long time, you could steal something that was worth just a few pennies, and that could be enough to land you in prison hundreds of years ago. Even in the 1960s, there were quite harsh laws and long penalties, really, for not just stealing, which was fair enough, but even if you received or bought stolen goods, the argument was, well, you should have known that the stuff was stolen. And the fact that you didn't know or there was no evidence you didn't know, we don't care. You received stolen goods, and you're going to. So I remember and the same in Australia. As a kid, I remember there was a guy in the street or in a nearby street who. And people were talking, the adults were talking about in hushed tones. I'd have been, I don't know, 5 years old or something. And the guy had bought something, like a camera or something like that from somebody who had stolen the camera. And the guy got, I think, 6 months hard labour. It wasn't just, 6 months of weekend detention or 6 months, night prison. It wasn't any of those. 6 months detention and hard labour for receiving stuff. The guy didn't steal it or anything. He paid for it. But the argument in the court was, well, you should have known. And even so, the burden of proof there was effectively reversed. You had to prove that you didn't know rather than the state having to prove that you did know it was stolen. So there was a certain sort of level of enforcement, but that was a class-based thing. It was assumed that wealthy people wouldn't go breaking, entering and steal property, whereas poorer people might, or people on a tighter budget might, or and so if you were buying an item, in this case, I think it was a camera. If you're buying a camera that you couldn't normally afford from your income, then that was seen in itself as somehow criminal. Know your place, know your status in society. You don't make enough money to live at that lifestyle. Therefore, we should treat you as someone who's stepping out of your lane. And I'm simplifying this a bit, but those sort of laws existed. Now, there was the guy who was doing either the stealing or was passing it on as some sort of, I don't know, commission agent or some shit. What was the scale of the robbery? Was this guy a known seller of stolen goods? Or, there are other things there that as a kid I didn't know about. But I remember that it was considered to be scandalous in the local area that this guy had received these stolen goods. And I don't recall anyone thinking that the sentence was harsh or that it was, wow, that's a bit heavy for just, buying something that someone else had stolen. Now today I don't think somebody would go to prison for that. They might, but it's hard to believe they would, because crimes against property are now pretty much gone to a large extent, not completely, to a large extent. Look at the Black Lives Matter people. They can go and burn down a building and all they'll get is probation. So crimes against property are no longer viewed with the same disdain as they once were. But crimes against ideology and forcing acceptance of unwanted ideology, then that now is the crime. So it's not a crime against property and theft and stealing, but crimes against ideology, and particularly imposition on ideology you don't agree with, or never voted for. So we've seen a complete shift in the emphasis. Now, that shift has occurred since the globalists took over. And that's really what I want to explore in this essay. Now, when you have a homogeneous population, ideology isn't per se an issue. Now, we can say during the 50s and 60s, during the Cold War, Marxist agitators and various subversives and so on who were advocating revolution, who were running around trying to stir up unions and stir up, folks in academia and so on. So capitalism is evil and Marxism is the future and so on. I don't know why the establishment, unless it was direct subversion of things, I don't know why the establishment is concerned. I don't think it ever would have got off the ground. And just to illustrate this, in the 1950s, in Australia, there was a national referendum to ban the communist political party. So the idea was, we will ban the communists. Now, this would have given the government license to go after known communists, people with communist membership, go after them, put them in prison, and those who got up to make public speeches about talking about communism, or for that matter, the evils of capitalism. It would have given the government the right because communism was banned or was proposed to be banned, to put them in prison. And there was a referendum about it in Australia where the people, quite rightly in my view, voted not to ban the Communist Party. Not that they weren't coming out with all sorts of nonsense and agitation and rubbish and subversion, they were. But the idea is it is the people's decision in a fucking democracy to make that determination whether they want the communists or not. And that should always remain. And the people decided against banning the Communist Party. And so I see that as the right decision. Now, when it comes to globalization, where mass immigration and so on was imposed on the people without their consent, there was no request or no consent from the people. In fact, the people have emphatically said time and time again, we don't want it. And governments, weasel globalist controlled governments have said, yeah, we'll stop migration. Yeah, we'll cut back on it. Blah, 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 and then do exactly the opposite once the election's over. So they've deliberately lied to, deceived and subverted the people. But how does this play out in a legal sense? Now, when the Romans had two areas, in the Roman Empire, the Romans had two areas that were always filled with drama and uprisings and all sorts of things. Two areas. One was what today would be, Serbia, Croatia, and the Balkans. The Balkans would be the so it's that area around there. And remember, this is 2,000 years ago. That area and the Middle East today, which is Palestine, Israel, and that area in the Middle East. So those two areas 2,000 years ago were filled with drama and carry on and assassinations and all sorts of warfare and squabbling. And today they're exactly the same. 2,000 years later, they're exactly the same. Now the historians like to paint the Romans as the big baddies, but why is it still a problem today, 2,000 years later? It was a problem when the Romans arrived. Part of the reason the Romans went into that area was to calm it down, because there was constant carry on and drama there, which was disrupting trade and so on. Armed bands of goons kept going into the Roman area and ransacking the place. So the Romans, quite naturally as anybody would, thought, okay, well, we got to put a stop to this nonsense, and they sent the military in to slap these dudes around. So anyway, again, these areas are hotspots today, let alone 2,000 years ago. They've been hotspots over the last 2,000 years. They've been non-stop. If you look at the Islamic, the Ottoman Empire, the Islamic Ottoman Empire that controlled much of that region for hundreds of years, the Grand Viziers, like the prime ministers and all that sort of thing of the Ottoman Empire, said really they were the same thing. And the drama from this area is outrageous. Why do we put up with this nonsense? So it's been an ongoing problem. Now, whenever there's a diverse population with very different views, which could be religious, they could be different religious views, different political views, different social structure views, and so on, the type of law that's applying, one common law applies to all. Typically, governments of any persuasion decide that you just can't have one law for all, because that leaves too many gaps for people that don't want to behave the same way. But when you have a homogeneous population, you can apply a set of, or much more easily at least, you can apply a set of laws that everyone will adhere to, because they all come from the same society, that have the same, more or less, the same attitudes, the same views, the same ways of looking at the world, the same habits and behaviors and so on. So one set of laws universally applied does tend to work fairly well. And that's, of course, in a very high trust society. You can do that. And laws can be impartial. The codification of the law needs to be clear and precise, and then everyone abides by those clearly codified laws. But in a society that comes from all over the world, very diverse in its views and attitudes, some are advanced technological, rule of law, high trust society. Others are low technology, tribal, zero trust societies. And so when you bring the two together, you have a very different attitude. You'll have a different challenge in applying the law. How do you apply the law in such a situation? Can it be a uniform law? Can it be one codified law? Because there's always going to be groups that, well, that law might suit those guys down the road. It doesn't suit us. It unfairly discriminates against us. So either you have to have multiple separate laws depending on the social grouping that's in, or you have to apply it with much stringency here, but much lower stringency there. So let's move to the challenges faced by the British administration in India. The Indian, what the British Empire did was they combined India and treated it more or less as a nation. Not that there weren't districts and regions and fiefdoms and what there were, but more and more, as longer the British were there, they had sort of national law courts and national railways and transports, and India began to see itself for the first time really as a nation. It didn't see it as districts and regions. Before the north of India was controlled by the Muslims, and the Hindus controlled this bit, and the Sikhs controlled that bit. More and more, which is still an issue today, incidentally. But more and more, India began seeing itself as a nation, which it hitherto hadn't done so. Now, with various agitators and troublemakers and stirrers and so on that were running around in India, blowing up bridges, blowing up railway tracks, ambushing small regional British garrisons and all sorts of things like that, abducting people, murdering British officials and so on. Not because of any sense of outrage that wrong was being done to them necessarily, but the Brahmin class, the upper class, pretended to go along with the British as that were the administrators of, if you like, the most of India. But in fact, they deeply resented the British being there, because the Brahmins were the upper social caste in India, and they were the demigods, and the peasants and the lower downs perceived them as demigods, and they lost a lot of that status while the British were there, and they never forgave the British for it. So for varying reasons, varying groups, Islamic groups, doesn't matter. There was a lot of Islamic agitation in the north, and what today, of course, is Pakistan and Bangladesh and so on. But the British had this issue that there were all these agitators and troublemakers, and the Indian mob was very easily fired up and ignited over just made up things that weren't true. There was a rumour would go by that the British were going to outlaw the Hindu religion, for which they weren't, but the rumour would go around. Agitators would set up the rumour, and before you know it, angry mobs would gather, and the city in India was relatively small. They had to put it down through sending in the army to put it down, and that meant there was dead bodies, which meant bad publicity. The British didn't want that, so no administration would, unless you've got a closed society like they had in the Soviet Union, where you can quietly murder or starve tens of millions of people, or China and so on. But so what did the British do? Now they would arrest these people and take them into the court, British justice. They would be charged, the evidence would be gathered, they'd be arrested, they'd be brought into court, and they'd have a British judge there. Well, most of them were. And even if the evidence was dead to rights, even if there was, no one questioned the evidence for even a second, the jury, which was nearly always Indian, would not convict. They simply wouldn't. I mean, occasionally they did, but most of the time they just wouldn't convict the accused. No one would dispute the evidence had them red-handed, but the Indian jury, we don't want to convict. We're going to convict one of our own. So they wouldn't, and this frustrated the British no end, because these criminals were walking free. They'd blow up the bridge or the railway track or whatever, and then they just walk free because the jury wouldn't convict. So what do the authorities do in such a situation where they've got a very hostile majority? In this case, they've got a very hostile majority, or within that majority are hostile elements, and the sympathies are very much with the local Indians, whether they've committed the crime or not. The sympathies with the local Indians. So the court So the British decided to make a number of adjustments. Remember, they're fearful of igniting that mass unrest may be ignited. Now, the British weren't imposing anything unusual or particular. It was just that the Indian nationalists wanted the British out, and the British quite rightly believed that if they left, then the whole trading system around Asia and or around that the whole trading system around Asia and or around that part of Asia and so on would break down and become unmanageable. It would all go to shit, which was, by the way, 100% correct. So, and that there would be large sectarian violence between Muslims and Sikhs and Hindus and so on. Again, the British were absolutely correct in that assessment. So they didn't think leaving was a good idea, but they realised, and they tried hard, I think, to sort of accommodate the local politicians and agitators and try and bring them into the fold rather than suppress them. Nonetheless, so the British decided, well, we've got to keep a lid on the potential unrest here, which is simmering near the surface, and it did frighten them for obvious reasons. And so they considered the mob to be fickle. All they need is just some silly rumor to go running around, and before you know it, the whole place will go up in flames. This was the attitude that the British administrators had, which was somewhat true, but it really overbaked the pudding, I thought. But anyway, so they thought, well, let's just reverse the burden of proof. So the legal system, we have to rejig it to suit our political objectives. So we can't have an impartial legal system because these juries won't convict. They won't convict one of their own. They won't vote for a conviction. So we either have to have very soft sentencing where we may be able to get a conviction, or we have to change the way we do legal business in India or other colonies. Africa could be included in this, for example, or parts of Africa. So they said, let's reverse the burden of proof. So we'll arrest someone that we think did it. There's no point just random arresting people, but it didn't mean they didn't do that. They did because it had an intimidation effect. So it was still considered as useful, even if it wasn't, you're arresting the guy who didn't do it, or arresting some rando person, or arresting someone who may have been somewhere near the illegal event. It had an intimidation effect. You see that attitude in Britain today, where you were somewhere near that protest, so we'll just arrest you anyway, which is an insane subversion of the law, but something we're seeing in Britain this very day. These so-called progressives who are, equity and justice, and they're just rando arresting people because they were nearby, putting them in prison. I mean, for fuck's sake. So the British would reverse the burden of proof in India and say, okay, now we've arrested you. You have to prove that you didn't do what we said you do, that they said you did. And also dispensing with juries, so be judge only, so that they would try and balance that out and say, well, instead of having a jury, which we know won't convict one of their own, we'll just have, say, 2 judges or 3 judges, and then we'll just rewrite the law. Again, this reversing the burden of proof. We'll also lower the burden of proof the state needs to meet in order to drag someone into court. Now, when you reverse the burden of proof, which makes it near impossible for someone to say that, someone to disprove it. Also, there are various other law where they could say that a witness was, a saboteur or an activist or somehow an unreliable witness because they were involved in the nationalist movement in India. So witnesses that would appear or could have appeared on behalf of the accused were disallowed, because they were another activist. So in that way, they could achieve convictions because A, the burden of proof was reversed, and B, witnesses appearing on behalf of the person were just simply deemed as irrelevant and dismissed, whereas witnesses appearing on behalf of the state were deemed to be reliable and dependable and so on. Now, we see that same architecture of justice, say, used in the divorce courts around the Western world today, and we see that increasingly used in politically subverted courts in the case of Britain, and also any area of ideological sensitivity, things like rape courts, feminist courts, divorce courts, and increasingly people opposed to mass migration or who question mass migration, they are now seen as the equivalent of the most radical, dangerous political subversives that could possibly imagine, which shows how jumpy the authorities are. They know that mass immigration and the sort of people that are selected for mass immigration, the illiterate peasants from Pakistan or whatever, it isn't working out. It's obviously manifestly not working out. But they're told by the globalists, no, you must keep going with this mass migration. You must do it at all costs. Kill whoever you have to kill, imprison whoever you have, but this must continue. And so they're very jumpy and jittery that because mass migration so clearly isn't working out, it's hard to imagine a less successful program that's ever existed in the history of humankind as mass migration. Particularly given the sources, from Africa and the subcontinent and so on. So the globalists are demanding that the British and elsewhere engage in the most high-handed subversion of the legal process. But you see this wherever the populations are not homogeneous and where the administration is attempting to impose something or continue something that the local population don't really want and don't support or may be opposed to. Now, the Romans had to do the same thing with their legal process in the Middle East, for example. And a classic example of that is the tale of Pontius Pilate and all the sort of stuff that the compromises that the Romans had to make. They had to make, as they perceived at the time, administering the area, had said, shit, we've got to keep a lid on the discontent here. This is a permanently inflamed population for whatever the reason. And so we've got to make concessions. We've got to, as in concessions, we've got to, throw out the laws and the rule books, and we've got to, so we can't apply Roman law here, but we can there. We have to allow local law here. Oh, in this case, we have to allow religious leaders to determine what the law should be. And so they were doing all sorts of somersaults around, again, what today is Israel and Palestine, to keep the peace and to maintain the continuity of their administration. We see the same thing in Britain today, to maintain mass migration and the continuity of a globalist approved and installed administration to continue the mass migration and so on, and the dismemberment of British society, white British culture. That administration needs to stay in place. In order for it to stay in place, they have to have this very aggressive lid on discontent. So they would see making mean tweets, well, that could ignite the mob, or that could further ignite or inflame discontent. So instead of dealing with the discontent, because the globalists won't let them do that, assuming they even wanted to, which I don't think they do, instead of dealing with the discontent, instead of dealing with the causes of the discontent, instead of doing what the people want, like in a democracy, instead of doing what the people want, the idea is you have to clamp down on the people and intimidate and arbitrarily arrest them. So this sort of structure, this architecture of it only comes about where you have non-homogeneous, low trust populations. High trust populations don't behave this way. They don't need this coercion. They don't need this thuggery. And it is thuggery, make no mistake. They don't need this thuggery to calmly administer the population. People just calmly write to their politicians. I go and see their local member of parliament and express their grievances. There are elections and so on. And there are politicians who get up saying, well, I'll address your grievances. But with the globalists, they won't allow any politician that is prepared to put an end to mass migration. They won't allow such a politician to even stand for political office. And you only get an outsider like Trump, once in a few generations. When was the last time you had an outsider like that? Theodore Roosevelt in the United States 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago. So these are the issues that we're looking at today, that there is deliberate and willful subversion of the legal process in order to achieve political objectives that are not approved of or supported by the populace. And that architecture remains the same, whether it was 2,000 years ago in Roman courts in Jerusalem, or 200 years ago in British administered courts in India or Africa, or indeed in Britain and elsewhere around the Western world. Look at the way the Biden globalist deep state Biden administration went over people that protested that flaky 2020 presidential election that was obviously rigged. And they go after those people just because they protested it. I mean, yeah, that's where we're at now. And it's a sad place. You've been with Tassers today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.